Okay, wonderful. It is noon here in Massachusetts, and so we will begin. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I'm the Managing Director here at PON. And for today's PON Live event, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Susan Podziba for a discussion entitled Civic Fusion and the Hidden Connective Energies of Conflict. Susan will be introducing herself, but I will just say in advance that she is an accomplished mediator in the sphere of public policy. She has worked with numerous branches of the US government, different international organizations, and other stakeholders in the public sector. She is the director of the Sacred Lands Project of the MIT Harvard Public Disputes Program and an instructor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at Harvard University, as well as internationally. Susan will be speaking for more or less 40 minutes. And during this time, there will be moments for discussion at the conclusion of the session. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom panel. The advantage of Q&A is it allows other folks to upvote if they have the same question as you. Of course, if you have a comment at any time, you may put it into the chat. This conversation will be recorded and it should be up on the PON website in a week or 10 days. It's taking a little more time these days for our captioning to get ready. So be patient with us, please, if it does take us a little bit longer, but we promise we will get it to you. Before I pass the microphone off to Susan, a special thanks to all of the PON staff members who have supported and made possible this event today, notably Anna Chang, Diane Long, and James Kerwin. Thank you for all of your work in getting us here. And now, Susan, I am very delighted to hand over the Zoom floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present to the PON community today. As Nicole said, I'm a mediation practitioner, and today I'm going to share with you some insights and observations from my practice. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Mike Wheeler and Howard Bellman related to mediation as jazz or improvisation. I agree with those characterizations. Mediation, and particularly mediation of complex disputes, requires action and intervention in the moment. That's what's exciting about it. I think for mediators, we have to think on our feet and act based on what's happening in the room. We sit in large groups of people who are in conflict and who express a range of interests, emotions, passions, and behaviors. And our work is to enable them to innovate solutions to their conflicts. So generally, I think we all have moments in life where something comes into focus in a way that we hadn't seen before. We may experience something that we've experienced numerous times, but all of a sudden it looks different or it feels different. Or we may connect with someone that we've never expected to connect with and feel intellectually, emotionally, spiritually stretched by that experience. Mediation is an ongoing series of those moments on a set of issues of critical importance to the convened group. And I'm going to share with you my thoughts about how to cause those moments and sustain those connections across deep differences in order to innovate solutions. More than that, my goal today is for you to have the experience during our time together of having a new experience, of being stretched, of seeing something differently. And my hope is that you walk away from our hour together and think afterwards that, wow, that makes me see something differently. So that's my hope. I'm going to share my screen because I do have some slides to share with you. So let's get started. I'm going to speak today about civic fusion, about energy sources and accessing those energy sources, and about how to design processes to sustain civic fusion. Oops. So let me say a little bit about civic fusion to start. I coined this term after I had facilitated abortion talks among leaders of the pro-life and pro-choice movements in Massachusetts after shootings here in my town of Brookline, Massachusetts. we brought them together to change the rhetoric that was being used on the issue of abortion because it had become quite violent in nature. And what happened when these women came together to speak with each other is that first there was a clear gap between them. There was a gap that was never going to be filled. When does life begin? Does life begin at conception? And do women have a moral right and moral agency to terminate a pregnancy? I'm sorry, okay, all right, just a little technical glitch there. So when they came together, I started to see, and we all experienced this bond between them. I started walking around with these magnets. As you can see, when you put magnets together, the positive and positive charge, you can't get a stable bond. And so I got very curious about that because I started to see in these talks what I called a paradoxical unity. That is, that there was a strong bond among these women, despite this difference, deep difference that they shared. So I tried to find out what that was. And I started to think there must be a natural way of explaining. There must be natural forces that would explain this experience. So I sent emails to some of the professors at MIT, to physics professors, and one of them kindly answered and said, sure, come on in and we can talk about what you're seeing and I may be able to help you understand it. And literally within 2 minutes of our conversation, he understood and explained to me what it was. So what is civic fusion? For those of you with a basic background in chemistry, you know that every atom has a nucleus. And in that nucleus are protons and neutrons. And the protons all have positive charges. So I think of those positive charges as the passion that people bring into the room. It's a positive charge and it's vibrant. But as you can see from figure 1.1, protons repel each other, just like the magnets do. But the bond, Professor Lightman explained to me, was actually a nuclear force. So when you bring the protons close enough together, the nuclear force kicks in and it holds those protons in place. Now, what's important for the metaphor of civic fusion is that those passions stay. They don't disappear, but they're held together by a stronger bond. And so I named this, after quite a bit of thought, I named this civic fusion. So let's talk about the energy sources. I find a strong need for powerful energies in order to get to achieve civic fusion. And those are power, passion, and conflict. So what is power? People come into the room with institutional power, with personal power, with powers of persuasion, and with power differentials, which creates its own kind of conflict. They also come into the room with passion, which we might describe as an overwhelming emotion beyond reason. They're passionate about the issues that they've come to negotiate. They're passionate about the way they see the world. And then there's conflict. Think about conflict as an energy source. When you're in a conflict with someone, remember how activated you are, when you're arguing with someone, you're focused, you're energized, you're insistent. So these are all energy sources that on one hand, people may suggest are the difficulties of a mediated context. But what I would suggest is they are available energy sources to break through habitual thinking, to achieve civic fusion in order to innovate resolutions. But what are some of the hidden energy sources? What are some of the ones that we may not think about? Think of certainty. In every case that I begin, there are people who come to the table with a great amount of certainty. They're sure about their position, they're sure about their perspective, and that it's the correct perspective. They're often also certain about how the situation should settle. And they may just think that the other parties are either uninformed or ignorant, or just simply don't understand the reality of the situation. But think about what it takes to actually sustain certainty, right? In our times, what we find is that we all say people are living in bubbles, and we take information that affirms the perspective that we have. Think about the energy that that takes on a daily basis. We're taking in information to affirm what we think we already know and to block out anything that would cause doubt. That's a lot of energy to put blinders on ourselves, to surround us. But what can we do if we can crack that certainty and bring about a sense of uncertainty, of not knowing? Then those energies start to become available for something new. But that's also an unstable situation. People are uncomfortable when they're uncertain or when they're not knowing. And the risk is that that uncertainty can move into fear. But as a mediator, what we're required to do is to turn that not knowing to a space of curiosity. And when we can get people from certainty to uncertainty and not knowing into curiosity, we can begin to have connections across their differences that lead to innovations. So how do we do that? How do we access energies to build capacity to connect across difference? And I'm going to share some images with you. They're not images that I use in a mediation, but they're merely to illustrate how what we do in a mediation is try to cause people to see something new, maybe, perhaps something surprising, perhaps something unknown. So I'm going to ask you in the chat to please, at various points, just list for me what it is that you see. Now, this is a very common image. You're probably very familiar with it. When I look first, and I would ask you in the chat to just say, what is it that you see? When you immediately look into this, what is it that you see? If you're looking at the white space, you see a vase. If you're looking at the black space, you see two profiles. If you only see one, I can easily point out to you the other. But you can't see both at the same time. You can focus on one or the other. And so in mediation, when people come in with a view, there are circumstances where it's easy to show them a different view, where they can begin to see that different view. But it can get more difficult, right? This is a situation of something unknown. And perhaps some of you are familiar. I'm going to open the chat because I want to see what you're saying. Tell me what color the dress is that you see. Could you please do me a favor and in the chat, what color is this dress? Well, I tell you a little bit about it if you're not familiar with it. So this is a dress that went viral. Why did it go viral? There was some young women who were shopping together, and they came upon this dress and they saw it differently. They saw it in different colors. And so they said, what color is it? They posted it on the web and they asked people, what color is it? And what happened is exactly what is happening in the chat. Some people saw it as blue and black. Some people saw it as gold and white. Some people saw it as brown and white. You can see the differences if you look at the chat. So what's happening? And why do I like this image so much? Because it's not unusual in public policy conflicts or any conflicts to have situations where people see a situation in a way and they can't see it in the other way. They simply, as in this case, their brain is wired to see particular colors, and they can't see the other colors. So this presents the situation for us of needing to, one, acknowledge that there are circumstances or situations that we simply don't have the capacity to see. But then we need to slow down the conversation in order to ask questions and to explain. So I see this dress as blue and gold. My husband sees it as gold and white. In order for me to understand what he sees, I need to say, where's the gold and where's the white? And I need to explain to him where I see the blue and where I see the gold. So this is a construct that we often see in mediation. We can't see the same realities, but we've got to take the time to share our understandings and to acknowledge the differences. Here's another one. Again, please tell me in the chat what you're seeing in this image. I think of this as breaking habitual thought patterns. I have this almost painfully logical mind. So when I look at this, I see squares and I see bars. But if you can look more closely, there are also circles in this. Can anyone see the circles? If you can just throw in the chat, yes, I see the circles. I'd love to know that. Most of us are seeing squares bounded by horizontal bars, right? But let me give you a little bit of a change. Here I put red lines around the circles. Now, if you'll let your eye just move, you may be able to see 4 rows of 4 circles. So people can see them. What this is for me in a mediated context is take people beyond their routine constructs. And not only that, we have the possibility of showing people things that are actually there that they didn't see. How exciting is that? To see something that you've looked at repeatedly, but you didn't see the whole picture. And so this is just an image to describe another occurrence in mediation. How do we use that in an actual mediation? How can this kind of use of images be helpful? I was mediating an environmental justice case, a civil rights case. And during the assessment, where I speak with each of the parties individually, I started to hear completely different views of air quality. From the regulated community and from the regulators, I heard we're in compliance with all required standards. And they were referring to something called the NAQ standards, the National Ambient Quality Air Standards, which is a federal law. It requires communities to place monitors in specific ways. The regulations identify how those monitor locations are to be identified. And those monitors look at the air quality, the ambient air quality. Now, those monitors are specifically not placed next to polluting industries, because then you would get a sense of what was going on in only that small area, as opposed to the ambient air quality of a larger region. The people at the fence line said, you can't be in compliance. We're getting sick. We're breathing in pollution. We have high levels of asthma. We've done our own tests, and we can see that you're not in compliance with the regulations. Both of them were right in some ways, but in order to get the conversation going, I had to draw out both of these perspectives and acknowledge that both of them could be true in different ways and at different times. Another way this comes up is, as mentioned, I've become very interested in sacred land disputes, and perhaps I've always been interested in sacred land disputes, but more recently I've had an opportunity to think and write about sacred land disputes. So the same question comes up of something new, something unknown, something not understandable when we ask the question, what is sacred, right? Most of us will say, yes, a house of worship is sacred. We can look at Jerusalem and say, Jerusalem is sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians around the world. And we all probably easily say that a cemetery or burial ground is a sacred land. But what about the mountain that isn't inhabited by humans, but has not been changed by humans, but is considered sacred and available for ritual and connection to the sacred by a people. There are many people who don't understand that, who don't have a space for that, who need to learn to, like the dress, ask questions in order to be able to acknowledge the difference among people. Another way of thinking about this I love is the allegory of Plato's cave. Essentially, none of us know the whole of it. Plato suggests that we're all actually sitting in a cave looking at shadows of reality, that none of us actually see it, and that in order to see reality, we need to be drawn out of the cave into the light to actually experience reality. I don't think any of us have the capacity to fully see reality, but I think it is critical for us to come to terms with the fact that none of us know the whole of it. And this is what occurs during a mediation. People come to understand that they're surprised. They don't know the whole of it. They thought they did. But through the mediation process, they come to understand that there are surprises that they can come to. So what are the bonding energies for connection across deep difference? We need to access the energy of passion, power, and conflict, and crack through the energies of certainty into curiosity. This is a Jackson Pollock painting, and I'm going to deviate for just a minute to tell you a story about why I love Jackson Pollock, why I love these paintings. I was doing a project for the United Nations, and while I felt quite confident in the advice I was giving and the way the project was going on the scale of what I was hired to do, I kept getting hung up in different ways that I didn't understand. I just did not understand what was going on. I was very frustrated, very confused. And so I left the UN and took a walk and went up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's not so far in New York. And I found myself in a room with two giant Jackson Pollock paintings. And I stood in front of one of them, and all of a sudden tears started coming down out of my eyes and down my face. And I looked and I looked and I said, this is a physical manifestation of what is going on in my mind. It felt like utter chaos, utter confusion. But after some amount of time, maybe a half an hour or so, I started to see the colors. I started to see the textures. I started to see the laws of physics in the way Pollock threw the paint or dripped the paint. And I started to understand that actually I can live in this complexity, that we need to live in the complexity of complex public policy disputes. And so I started to use this image to help people understand that, yes, it feels chaotic, but we can move within that complexity. We can make sense of that complexity. So back to Civic Fusion. People bond across passionate difference to solve a shared public problem through emergent innovation. The piece of the field that I love, that I feel like I bring to you is I want that difference. I want that passionate difference to be sustained. I want the colors to be vibrant. I don't want everything to become similar. It's within those differences, within the sharing of those differences of something new, something surprising, something unknown, that once people can live in that complexity, they can start to solve their shared public problem through emergent innovation. Because with a whole group of people beginning to see their situation in different ways, they can start to innovate solutions that never would have emerged without the changed perspectives and the new understandings and the stretching, the intellectual stretching of themselves. But it takes a series of moments I know that many of us have had experiences where we meet people who are different from us, but then we have a hard time re-entering with that new information in order to make changes, right? We get stuck when we go to our own communities and try to describe those moments. And what we know then about civic fusion and about solving complex disputes is that we need a process designed to sustain civic fusion. It's not enough to just have a couple of moments, but the mediator is trying to create the possibility of an ongoing series of a set of these moments on the issues of critical importance to the convened group. So the process design is a strategic process infrastructure that enables diverse groups to develop an actionable and sustainable agreement to resolve a complex conflict. And I don't have time to go deeply into it. I want to just touch a bit of what process design is. So every process has 5 basic building blocks. It has the product. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Is it a memorandum of understanding, a city charter, a constitution, a regulation? What is the written product that will emerge from successful negotiations? There's also often something I call a complementary goal, which is what needs to happen during the process in order for the product to be actionable. It's a mouthful. So let me give you an example. When I worked in Chelsea, Massachusetts to develop a new city charter to protect the city against corruption because of a strong history of corruption, in order to make sure that city charter would be protective and would provide a strong governance structure, people in the city needed to learn about self-governance, and they needed to engage in self-governance in the creation of their new charter. And so in that case, the product was a city charter or a constitution, and the complementary goal was engaging people in self-governance. And the process design needed to integrate that complementary goal in order for the result to be actionable. Another basic building block is mediated negotiations. There'll always be some sense of people being brought together, but mediated negotiations also has within it multiple choices to be made within process design. There'll be joint sessions, there'll be work group sessions, there'll be caucuses. What's the sequencing of issues within the mediated negotiations? There'll be outreach and consultations. So if those sitting at the mediated negotiations are representative stakeholders, they'll need to do outreach to their constituents. They'll need to check in with their superiors. There also may be people who are not at the table but need to participate in some shape or form, again, in order for the product to be actionable. And so part of process design is designing those process mechanisms that enable people not at the table to participate, and for the effort of their participation to be integrated into the mediated negotiations. And finally, trusted information. That's a tough one for us in our days, given that there's so many alternative facts flying around. But trusted information is often a useful tool, particularly when there is an issue among a series of issues that people are confused about. An example of that is when I mediated a process to develop worker safety standards for construction cranes. One of the most difficult issues had to do with testing prototype cranes. There was a lot of passion, a lot of anger. It was definitely identified as one of the most difficult issues when we started. But when we got to that issue, it turned out there weren't very many people who really had the information needed to have a constructive, productive discussion on the issue. So with agreement of all, we identified the chief engineer of a German crane company as a trusted expert, and he came and explained what his company did to verify prototype cranes. And eventually that issue went away because of his presentation. Process designs are critical They need to match the unique characteristics of the situation. So one does an assessment in order to design a process. And I like to say the process needs to match the situation like a hand in a glove. There's no cookie cutter approach. As I said, there are basic building blocks, but how you design each block and how you sequence them is critically connected to what the situation is. And luckily for us as mediators, the complexity provides numerous paths. There's no one correct process design for a situation, but there needs to be a well thought out and planned and resilient process design in order to sustain those ongoing series of moments on a set of issues of critical importance to the people at the table. Just to give you some examples of process designs, I'm not going to go through these, but I just wanted to help you see each of those, I will tell you, includes each of the 5 basic building blocks. But as you can see, they take on different shapes and sequences. So in sum, I would say we need to access existing energies, the passion, the power, and the conflict, as well as the certainty and uncertainty. We need to strive for civic fusion, for connection across energized difference. The differences are critical. People don't need to become the same. They need to acknowledge and understand those differences and work while holding those multiple perspectives in mind at the same time. Because we need that series of moments, through the process, we need to build ongoing resilience for uncertainty and complexity. Generally, people don't find themselves in these long-term situations of uncertainty and complexity. In a complex mediation, they will be. And so there needs to be a means for building resiliency and relationships across that. And finally, be sure to design a process to sustain civic fusion for emergent innovation. I think I'll stop there and open up for questions.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you so much, Susan. Really appreciate it. And everyone, now is the time. We see that some of you have started, but please use the Q&A function to enter your questions into the chat. We had a question on narrative mediation, Susan. Is this a part of civic fusion, and what should we know when thinking about it?
Narrative mediation, I'm not sure that I am tied into that strain of mediation. So I think if it's okay, I might pass on that. We do, I mean, people are bringing their stories and narratives, and I think the way I connect to those is on the question of certainty, right? So how certain is your narrative, and how open does one's narrative need to be in order to take in additional information?
Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question from Faye, who wanted to ask about how one starts to design a process and what the things are to begin that. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So the first thing is an assessment. An assessment is essentially interviewing many people involved in the situation, right? So you may interview 20, 30, 60 people in order to get a very strong sense of the conflicts, of the situation, of the stakeholders, of the history, of the past efforts to resolve the situation. And so based on that assessment, one can begin to see who needs to participate, in what ways, who are the likely representative stakeholders, who needs to be involved for outreach and consultation, what are the healthy associational networks that already exist. So that's one of my favorite things. So in Chelsea, which was basically their democracy was flat out. 3 of their past 4 mayors were incarcerated on corruption charges. They were taken over by the state because the city was essentially bankrupt. But within that community was a very healthy social club organization. And we could build on what was already there in order to access people to teach them about self-governance. So in other words, when you do the assessment, you're looking for all of the dynamics, all of the chaos, what makes it feel like chaos. And then from that, you can start looking at the basic building blocks and setting up what are the component parts.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a question of what to do when establishing trusted information and one side or the other is not receptive to the facts as put out. How do you push forward in that to get folks to take on the other's point of view?
Right. So it's really not to take on the other point of view. So the first thing is there an expert that everybody will trust? That's the easy case. But most of the time, there is no single person that would be trusted by all of the parties. So I, in those instances, would convene a panel of people who had multiple perspectives, and then let people ask questions of the people who have the perspective differing from them. And the questions that I would ask have to do with the assumptions. What are the assumptions upon which your expertise is sitting, so that we can understand why you're coming to the conclusion that you're coming to, right? So what we always know is you have to start somewhere. So you start with a set of assumptions. And by exploring those assumptions, by exposing those assumptions, the participants are able to get a joint understanding of the actual conflict, because they can see what the different assumptions are. So that's one of the ways of doing that. Sometimes there are organizations that people trust. Again, it's varied. So as with every other component of the process design, how you find and access trusted information has a whole lot to do with what the situation is. And it's not about persuading. It's really about exploring.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer. Lots of questions about putting participants at ease and facilitating them throughout the process. So a question on what do we do with participants who are really uncomfortable with this idea of uncertainty and complexity and how this process is going to go? What would you say to them?
Right. So there's a long process for doing that, right? So I start with an assessment, and part of the goal of the assessment is also to build relationships with people. So I don't want to walk in the room of 30 people in conflict and never have seen them, never have met them, never have spoken to them. So in that assessment interview, not only am I learning about the process, about the situation, but I'm also giving them a lot of opportunities to ask me questions about the process. I'm describing the process. I'm sharing some information about myself so they can feel a connection with me. And one of my favorite questions during those interviews, when I see people are very nervous, is I say to them, what's your nightmare scenario? What's the worst thing that you can imagine happening as a result of these negotiations? And they'll tell me some solution that they completely oppose. And then I'll say, well, given that the decision rule is likely to be consensus, meaning that everybody in the room has to agree, it's probably unlikely that you'll agree to that. So therefore, that nightmare scenario can't happen. That's something that often you see people relax as they start to come to terms with what the process might look like. And then I like to start with negotiating a set of ground rules, right? What are the organizational protocols that will govern the process? So we get clarity on what's our mission. What are the roles and responsibilities of the negotiators? What are the roles and responsibilities of the mediators? How will we interact with the media? And you go through this, and a couple of things happens. One is they get to practice building a consensus document. Second of all, people connect across their differences on issues that have to do with process that don't have to do with their substance. So you already get some curiosity across people who didn't think they would agree with someone about anything, but they actually agree on something about what their roles and responsibilities are, or how quickly the meeting summary should come out. So they start to engage in a way that they never expected to engage. And then we go slowly through the issues, right? And my style is to talk through all of the issues without negotiating first. So I call that workshopping the issues. So they want to go at each other, but I hold them back. I just say, no, we're just learning. What are the components? Let's deconstruct this issue so that we all understand where everybody is on that. And then by the time they're ready to start coming up with a sense of how to address the issue, they already have a lot of information. They already have seen each other. They've probably, we try to have social events, lunches, dinners, baseball games in the pre-COVID world. So it slowly emerges that what actually happens, what's so exciting about this is people start to act out their best selves. Right? They start to see themselves as working with others, as allowing themselves to be stretched beyond where they were before, and they like themselves. They feel good about their participation. And then they connect with other people who are also expressing their good sides. And so then they start to like the group because they're all together happy with the way they connect. And it creates a great bond. That's the Civic Fusion bond that connects them, even though their differences are intact. And they're able to then talk through those differences. And yeah, sometimes people get very passionate and very upset, but we can always bring it down to break down the issue into its component parts and brainstorm together, come up with new ideas, come up with new options. What are the different ways? Given that you now understand the different perspectives in the room that you didn't understand before, how can we build something new?
That's great. And Susan, we're getting lots of questions that are feeding off of that are around, the initiation with participants, and to what extent you obviously set expectations and norms for how things are going to go. And is that a top-down from you in a mediator's role, or is it something you bring the participants in together? And I guess I would say on one hand, we've got questions about expectations, and on one hand about process design. Do you involve the parties in that design process as well?
So it goes both ways, and it depends on the complexity of the situation. I think more and more it's about involving the parties. If it's a negotiated rulemaking, for example, and I've done 24 of those, I pretty much have a sense of the basis of it, and I'll refine that based on the unique characteristics of that one. But in a more complex one, I think you're always testing, you're always asking questions. So I am not a top-down mediator. I'm more of, I think of myself as a midwife. I'm there to deliver the baby of this group. So I'm there really as a support and bringing forth their ideas. But I have a process expertise. I see myself as having a process expertise. So I'll set out a draft. I'll bring a draft, for example, of ground rules, which are very important for the structure and expectations. I'll say, here's a set of ground rules that I've used, in other cases, and I might have different options in them. And then they'll design those ground rules based on what their needs are. I will say that I love process. I live in the world of process. It's an abstract level that most people don't think about. And so a lot of times I get pushed back and they say, you do it. We don't want to think about that. You just tell us how we should do this. But I do want to engage them because I want it to be their process. And the ownership of the process and the engagement of it is critical. It's not about me. It's not about, I'm going to go away. They're the ones who are going to implement it when I'm gone. So it's really critical that every step of the way has their commitment and engagement to it.
Yeah, that's great. We have a question from Amber about the evolution of the process. How often do you find yourself changing the process that you've laid out in response to what's happening, and what's the best way to navigate that?
That's a great question. And yes, because even though you can do a very thorough assessment, you can't know everything that that there is about that situation. And because you're working, I tend to work over a period of 3, 6, 9, 12 months. Things happen in the middle of it. So you need to adjust. The process then needs to be resilient. You need to be able to change it on an as needed basis. But you need to bring people along with that as well. Like, why is this changing? What's happened that something different has to occur? Or you might have had some mechanism, for example, for outreach and consultation that just isn't working. People aren't showing up. So you need to ask the question, what's going on and how might we adjust in order to gain people's trust and engagement. So yeah, I mean, again, the thing about mediation is it's such a dynamic process. It's always happening and moving, and things come up that you just can't, you hit a wall sometimes. You hit a deadlock, right? And so you need to always be thinking about, what can I do differently? How can this shift? Where are we? How come I didn't think we were going to be here? So it is a continually dynamic process. And as long as you are transparent in every step that a mediator takes, I thought we were going to have this series of meetings, but it seems that it doesn't make sense now. Here's my suggestion. As long as you're transparent, you can help the group move to a refined process design.
That's great. Speaking of evolutions, we had both Elliot and Charlotte asking about how your modes or methods have changed or adapted to a virtual environment in, this evolution of an environment we're all still adjusting to. Are there any changes in process design in the mediative process? Are there maybe advantages in this situation as well that you found?
That's a really good question. And I would say an evolving process for me. I really love being in the room with people. I really love contact with people. I love the interactions during breaks. And so Zoom is really, it's really hard for me. I find, in some ways, Zoom is exactly the opposite of what I need, right? We're all in these bounded boxes. And what I want is sort of more fluidity. I want people to be more fluid. I want people to see each other, to feel the energies in the room. So it's really complicated for me. What I find is I'm using a lot more caucusing because I can't have 15 or 20 people in a productive conversation on Zoom. So it's more technical, I would say. I don't like it. I know that for some of my colleagues, they find it really helpful, really efficient, no need to travel. I love the travel. I'm doing a project in South Dakota right now. God, would I love to be walking around in the Badlands and go and visit the school. That's the subject of the discussions, and meet the people, not only the ones who are negotiating, but the people who are living and attending the school. So it's hard for me. And I can't say I've made a great transition. I think I'm doing a lot more analytical work. I'm teaching process design, creating process design tools for others. So it's a tough road, and I hope that it will be at least behind us enough that we can all start to get together again in large groups and connect across our differences in real life.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I think I'm sure you're very modest and have made a great transition, but I do understand that it feels it is still a struggle to adjust to this new working environment as it continues to be for all of us. We have a lot of questions on issues of the day, and it's, ask a mediator how you would solve a lot of sticky issues. So if you can get them all resolved, there might be a peace prize in here for you, Susan, later on. But there was first a question that was just on the level of, since you've worked in the public sphere for so long, have you seen and felt in your work this increased polarization and the effects of that? Is that just a public perception that some of us, myself included, might have? Do you actually see it from a professional standpoint?
I'm not seeing it in cases because when I'm working on a case, people are committed to a resolution, right? They wouldn't have called in a mediator because unless they were willing to work towards a resolution. I will say that I look at our current situation as a nation, and as somebody who has sat professionally in the middle of conflict for over 30 years, there is something markedly different. And I think what we can say is people are solidified in their own camp. We have all of these means for taking in affirming information, and we're no longer curious about the other. We just are sure that the other is immoral, irrational, completely wrong, and we've lost some of the curiosity of connection. I've been in 49 of the 50 states of these United States. I've met people from all over, and I find Americans tend to be a very generous, warm-hearted people. And so I'm so sad. It hurts me so deeply to see what's going on right now. And it is different. It's different from anything I've ever experienced in my life.
Okay. And we had a specific question, Will, from multiple people about whether Civic Fusion could be brought to the U.S. Capitol, and is there a way that we could think about that? It does seem that things have changed from a political standpoint, and that's, of course, I'm speaking to our American audience, which is a good portion, but not all of the folks who are with us today. Do you see that there is a process that could be designed somewhere and to get to a better resolution on many of the issues of the day? Now, if we were to take each of them are obviously very different, but is there a way to come to some kind of mediated resolution?
So I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer that question in two different ways. The first is, if there's a particular set of issues that would be amenable to mediation, yes, we can bring this to those issues. One of the issues that I think would be fascinating, and I wrote an op-ed in the Hill for this, is the question of privacy in cyberspace. I think that's an issue that everybody has similar goals for, at least the public has similar goals for. We're moving in that direction for the government as well, for both sides of the aisle. And I think when we talk about regulating social media companies, I think you could do a negotiated rulemaking that would lead to connection and an outcome, a set of regulations that was satisfying to the public at large. I think that's a connective issue. Another thing that I am curious about is I'm starting to hear from the right and the left a fear of fascism. Right. So the left fears that the rise of white nationalism is going to lead to fascism. Some on the right feel that this idea of mandates, vaccine mandates, is a sign of fascism to come. So if there's agreement from the far right to the far left that we don't want fascism, maybe we need to have a conversation about what is fascism and what do we do to protect us as a nation from fascism. So I just found that as a curiosity when I started, because I read the press of the right and the left, and when I started to see over and over an opposition to fascism, I said, well, that's kind of interesting. If we can get around that, maybe we can really do something that will secure our democracy. On Capitol Hill, I actually did a project with Bruce Patton. He's still working on it, called Rebuilding Congress, the Rebuilding Congress Initiative. And I met with about 30 or 40 members of the US House of Representatives. And I learned a lot. I think what worries me right now, and so I actually gave them my book. So Civic Fusion is all over Capitol Hill in people's offices, whether or not people are reading it. But one of the things that I learned that's very, very frustrating to me is Congress is malfunctioning because people are all about power. They're not about using power. They're about gaining more and more power. One of the members of Congress that I met with said, my business is power, and my goal is to just get more of it. So it's like an inability to be satisfied with the amount of power that you have. And I just read an interview with Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire. He was asked why he decided not to run for Senate. And he said he asked Republican members of Congress what their plan was for the next 2 years. And they said their only goal was to make sure that Biden failed. That was their goal. And that maybe they would get the White House. And then he asked them, well, if we get the White House in 2024, what will we do that we couldn't have done when we had all three branches of government before? And he didn't get any satisfying answers. And I found that to be very, very commensurate with the way I'm viewing Congress at this point. So for me, some of the polarization, I know there are a lot of efforts on the polarization side to bring citizens together, to bring people together across their differences. But for me, it's a failure of leadership. When I think of two of my favorite moments in recent American times, it's when on 9/11, President Bush said, we're not at war with Muslims, we're at war with extremists, and tamped down as a leader some of the fear that was happening in the country. Similarly, when John McCain was running for president, and a woman at a rally said, Obama's a Muslim and he's evil. And McCain said, no, Barack Obama is a fine man. He's a patriot. And I have policy disagreements with him. This is the kind of leadership that we need today in order to start addressing polarization. It's got to come, yes, from the bottom, but it also has to come from the top. We need responsible leadership of the sort we saw in past decades.
I love that moment also, Susan. It's a very powerful image and a testament to the late Senator McCain. We have sifting through because, of course, we were running out of time, and so we're not going to get to ask all of the questions. But this is one that I really liked about how, and of course now I've lost it, and I'm sorry, I'm sifting while I get in there. In moments of fear, could you cite an example of when you were able to spark curiosity amongst participants? So a success story from your own work.
Oh, when people might have been afraid, but they became curious.
Yeah. When you were able to work that turnaround.
So I will talk about the first meeting of the abortion talks. People were first of all, there was a lot of fear because there were just two women were killed at health clinics, and there was the threat of violence. It was quite grave. And they were fearful of meeting the people that they considered almost enemies at that time. They had argued on TV before, but they had never had a conversation with each other. And so one of the things that we did at that very first meeting is we did a hot button exercise. So we asked everybody to yell out, to say words that they shut down when they hear. What are the words that are used in the abortion debate that shuts them down so they can't hear anymore? And so we got words like fetus, we got words like unborn child, feminazi, murderer, and we listed all of these words around the entire room on flip charts. And then we asked them to have a conversation about the issue of abortion without any of those words, because each of those words was a code. It wasn't just a word. Within each of those words was a whole philosophy and worldview. And so we asked them to try to have a conversation without any of those words. And of course, it was very difficult. It forced them to think beyond how they usually spoke. But what also happened is they were unable to do it. And so every time somebody said a word that was on the chart, someone else would say, no, you can't use that one. And they were doing that together. And so it wound up being quite a fun exercise that really led to the beginning of their bond and their curiosity about each other.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I think on that note of a great success story, we are going to end this discussion because we could keep going for 2 more hours, but we've had so many questions, and Susan, you have been wonderful. Thank you so much for this informative chat, and thanks, of course, to all of our participants for tuning in. It's always such a pleasure. This is only our 2nd event of 2022, and I for one, am very glad to be with you and resuming these discussions. If you want to stay in touch with the program on negotiation, please plan in just 10 days, or no, next week. I'm sorry, I'm losing track of my days, and we're only in January, for an event with Dolly Chugg and Max Bazerman, and put on your calendar all of the many programs that we are offering over the course of the spring, many virtual, and then starting in May, going back in person. And hopefully it will no longer be snowing in New England by the time we are hosting you again on campus. So thank you to everyone. Thank you so much, Susan. Once again, this recording should be available in about 7 to 10 days on the PON website. It takes a minute to get it captioned and set up there, but we look forward to having it there for you so that you can revisit and share. Thanks to everyone. Please stay healthy and well, and we will see you soon again at PON. Bye.